What I'm going to talk to you about today is really just sort of a few things that come from all of the learning that I have had the privilege to do over the last number of years, related to school food and also to really kind of the academic around food sovereignty, because I think school food and food sovereignty there's a lot that the two have to do with each other. So I'm just going to give you my thoughts based upon what I've learned over the years, but you probably also have lots of things to contribute as well. So again, I'm always a little uncomfortable with sort of the idea of someone being an expert, because I think we're all experts, especially when it comes to food. Okay, so I want to give you some context. Canada is unusual as a country in that we do not feed our kids in school typically. The majority of kids don't get some sort of meal in school. Around the world, it's close to 3/4 of kids get a meal in school. And in affluent countries, so in rich countries like Canada, it's even more kids who typically get a meal in school. But globally, a kid goes to school and they also get something to eat. It's not the bring your lunch, your packed lunch, the way it is in most cases in Canada. And I always have to start by saying that, because I think for most people who've lived in this place their whole lives, including me, I just made the assumption that the way we do things is the way that everybody does things, but that's not the case. I also want to say that when surveys are done of what kids are eating during the school day, this is all kids in Canada, what kids are eating is not very, it's not very nutritionally sound. And that's whether kids are coming from high-income families or low-income families or anywhere in between, it doesn't matter. Kids across Canada in every community are not eating very well during the school day. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Also, around the world, school food programs make a really important contribution to jobs, to health. They create jobs, they support local agriculture. They are important for kids' education outcomes. They have all sorts of benefits all around the world. So, I probably don't need to tell any of you this, but when we talk about foods, we talk about everything in our society. Everything from, right now it's the beginning of February and it's plus, 4 or 5 degrees outside. It both feels like a blessing and a little bit terrifying, right? Mm-hmm. To live and to know that we're experiencing climate change right now. The food system impacts climate change, and climate change impacts the food system. All the ways in which some people have power and other people don't, that's connected to our food system. There are many ways in which have contributed to people being in the situations they are. Some people living in poverty and other people not, can be connected to the food system. There are so many things about the way our world is built that are connected to food. So for me, we have the potential to teach our kids so much about the environment, about treating people with respect, about treating the land with respect, about all sorts of things through food. We also know that there's some really good research showing that kids can get involved in both growing food, harvesting food, and preparing it. And they learn a lot from that. There's a lot of learning that comes from that. And kids who have prepared food or who have worked in a garden or harvested are more likely to eat that food that they've harvested themselves. So just to kind of give you a bit of the history of school food around the world. In the early days of school food programs, mostly in European countries, they started because there was a war in whatever country it was, and they started to conscript, usually men, into war to be soldiers, and they would discover that they were not strong enough, their bones were not strong enough, or they were too small, or they had various health issues that made them not able to be soldiers. And that was often why school food programs started around the world, was when there was a realization by governments that young men were not strong enough to go to war. It's kind of an odd thing to think about, the idea that that would be the reason why we want to feed people well, so that they can fight in wars. I have my own sort of issues with that, but it's an interesting piece of information to think about where that comes from. And then in the last sort of generation, in some places, and more recently in other places, there was a realization that it's not just about calories and sort of putting energy into people's bodies, it's also about the quality of that food. And so really in the last number of years, there's been a desire to improve the quality of school food offerings. And these are things that we're talking about these next couple of days. But quite recently, really in the last few years only, and very new in Canada, there's been a move towards school food programs that not only provide food, but also provide a broader learning context. So taking kids onto the land, incorporating various kinds of land-based learning, having gardens on the school premises, harvesting, apple trees, having orchards, all those sorts of things. Even growing food in the classroom, so little tower gardens. I know some of you have tower gardens in your schools. And then also having kids involved in preparing food. So this is kind of what researchers call the third phase. This is where we're at right now when it comes to school food programs. In Canada, school food programs have existed in various ways for about 100 years. They've existed for a long time, but they've never been supported by the federal government, except for in some circumstances. In some First Nations communities they are, but it's pretty minimal. During the Second World War, there was a real push to having a national program in Canada, and that was the time when the United States got their program, when a number of other countries got their programs. But at the end of the Second World War, this was talked about in Chatelaine magazine, and the Red Cross was at the forefront of school food programs, and there was a lot of sort of public momentum. But then at the end of the war, the federal government put in place family allowance program. Any of you remember the family allowance? I remember my mom getting the check when I was a kid, and then it stopped because they cut the program in the early 90s. So they put in place a family allowance program and said, okay, we've done everything we need to do. We don't need to, a school food program isn't necessary. And that was the way that the federal government saw school food. And in fact, what they said was that really it was an issue of ignorance, that parents just needed to learn how to feed their kids better. And you didn't need school food programs. Okay, so on this slide, there's been a bunch of change that's happened in that there's been a lot of work from a lot of people who've tried to get us to a place where we would have a national school food program in Canada. 2019 was the first time since the Second World War that the federal government said that they were going to, I think the language they used was, they put out this called Food Policy for Canada, and it specifically said that they would work with the provinces and territories towards a national school food policy and program. So that was the first time for a long time that happened. And then there's been budgets that have said, We're going to work towards a program that some ministries federally have been tasked with the job of creating some sort of a national school food policy. So there's been a bunch of movement recently. Also, the food guide that came out in 2019, which is not perfect by any stretch, but is a lot better than the old one, not having food groups, being a lot more general and incorporating a lot of more different various food cultures. Is the food guide that exists now is way more inclusive of all sorts of different ways of eating in comparison to what we've had in the past. But I think what's most important about it is not the guide itself, but what goes along with the guide. There are these statements that were part of the guide which we've never had before. So they say, be mindful of your eating habits, cook more often, enjoy your food, eat meals with others, use food labels, limit foods high in sodium, sugars, or saturated fat. These ones are a little bit more conventional, and then be aware of food marketing. But I think this idea that a food guide would say, cook and eat with others. Let's think about the way that it's not just about what we eat, but it's how we eat it. So that was the first time that the government acknowledged that that's very important to eating. I'm going to guess one of my teenagers is calling me. Nope. Okay. A few researchers, we wrote a paper a few years ago that put out a list of what we thought were important, based upon what we understood from looking at research around the world, important aspects of a program, some sort of national program for Canada. And those are that they, number one, be universal, meaning no more school food programs where food is offered to some kids and not to others. That there's, oh, this kid needs the program, this kid doesn't. Because that brings stigma, and it means that lots of kids, lots of parents will not let their kids participate because they don't want to be perceived as needing something, so that they be universal. So all kids are offered the same food in the same environment at school. Number two, that they be health promoting, that they be consistent with, especially things like including lots of vegetables and fruit, high quality proteins, but really that we think about the bigger picture of health promotion, not just nutrients, but also about some of those things, being mindful, eating together, all of the relationships around food. Number three, being respectful. So recognizing that what a school food program looks like in one community will be different from what it looks like in another community. That we need to make sure that programs are adapted to local needs. What we're going to have in the neighborhood where I live in inner city Saskatchewan, is going to be different from what might be in your community. Number four, connected, meaning connected to communities. So a school food program isn't just a school food program. It's connected to the broader school, to the people who are connected to the school, to families, to all the people who might otherwise sort of come in and support programs. So a school food is not just about that food, but it's about the broader school community. Number five, multi-component, meaning it's not just a meal, but it's also a meal and gardening and other kinds of land-based learning. It's all of these things together. And then finally, sustainable. And primarily what we meant in this was financially sustainable, pretty heavily involved at the very beginning, was to improve community food security, well-being, and self-determination. So those are all related to food sovereignty, by supporting the development of culturally appropriate, Indigenous-led school food programs that are essential to the reclamation of food sovereignty. So that's what we wrote down on paper at the very beginning when we put together this project. And I think this is exactly what we're trying to do right now. A little quote that I included here. This is one that Patricia shared with us, and it says, as Indigenous peoples, everything we do to reclaim our culture, which includes food sovereignty and decolonization, is an act of ceremony. I think that's where I wanted to end it. No? Okay, I have a couple more slides. It seems like a good place to end. Okay. I guess, so the question then becomes, how can school food contribute to Indigenous food sovereignty? And there's just a few ideas. I think these are all your ideas. These all came from you. There's not one of these ideas that was not captured by Tammy and Steph, not from some of you. So there's a whole bunch of great ideas that you put forward. So involve elders, community leaders, pay school food workers a living wage, provide training, which we're doing today, and value the roles and skills that you have, and also provide opportunities for summer employment for community members, so gardening, harvesting, various kinds of food prep programs, and we've been talking about that the last couple of days. Local control, so that there's a need to build some local food and school food infrastructure, so everything from your kitchens and the facilities that you have, to also potentially having some of your own food distribution. So including commercial kitchens, so develop food systems on school grounds, gardens, food forests, greenhouses, meat drying, smoking, various kinds of infrastructure to keep, to be able to have more control over the food that's offered. Develop food storage and distribution, as I said, and shorten the food chain. So use local food sources, focus on nearby sources, and collaborate with other nearby communities. And I know some of you are doing that already. In terms of local and traditional foods, I know you've all said that you want to offer more traditional foods on your menu. Sometimes that's hard to do, and there's barriers to it, but that's important. Build food-based skills into the land, language, relationship, and culture programming. Build relationships between schools and local hunters and foragers. And make sure you have ways of safely storing traditional food for its use in your school food programs. Under gardening and growing, you said you want to build the infrastructure you need to grow. So indoor and outdoor gardening, grocers, the towers, various kinds of fence gardens, those darn deer, raised beds, orchards, food forests. There's a whole lot of ways that you have talked about what you could do around your schools. So some of you have talked about involving students, and you already involve students. Because the more kids learn to try new foods early, the more likely they are to eat those in the long run. We've had so many amazing stories in the work that we're doing in Saskatchewan, and I'm sure the same exists in your communities, where kids who were not willing to try something, it got offered enough times in a school food program, and eventually all of a sudden they were willing to try that new food. You talked about building curriculum around growing, harvesting, preparing, cleaning, tasting food, all of these things. And I know at least some of you talked about the idea that you could potentially share with others. So you could grow your own food or produce your own food in the school context, and potentially either trade with other schools or share with community members, with elders in the community. So if you produce more, then you're able to use in your program. Okay. These are all the organizations involved. There's a whole lot more people, but these are the organizations involved in this project. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.